I'd like to introduce to you this book, God's Cure for Our Nation. And the chapter headings in this book is America Terminal? And then case histories of other sick societies, major surgery without anesthetic, God's discipline on Israel, the antidote for apostasy, problems to be solved in order to obtain good spiritual and moral health again in America, the development of new converts. Once we see a spiritual awakening, there must be a better biblical program to develop people to be mature Christians. And then the whole thing is, it's either abundant health or damnation. Either we will have revival or else our country will be destroyed. And in the foreword, I say anyone who knows anything about a Bible and the situation in America today knows that our country is a very sick nation. Some say she's terminal. There's no hope. Others are so busy living and pursuing their own ambitions that they don't even know there's any major problems. Many may shrug their shoulders and say, well, America's no worse than what she was in other times. We just hear more about it. But God's Cure for Our Nation is a book which boldly attacks the defeatism and despair that grips the hearts of many of God's people and pastors who have all but given up hope for our country. God's Cure for Our Nation, we picture America as a seriously ill, even terminal patient who seeks a doctor's opinion. The doctor examines the patient and defers his announcement until he can look at other similar case histories. He said, you're very sick, but I won't say you're terminal until I can consider other case histories of similar problems. The first case history is rebellious Jews under the leadership of Moses who were placed in isolation. You think about it. Whenever they rejected God's leadership, then he said, you'll wander out here in this desert, this hot desert in isolation, and see the fruits of rebellion against God. The daily funerals and tears were good object lessons to the survivors as they buried their fathers and grandfathers who rebelled against God. Under the leadership of Joshua, they crossed the Jordan River and had great victories. So case history number one, worse than we're in today, was followed by a tremendous revival of God's Word and God's will on this earth. The second case history is recorded in the book of Judges, where there's 7 apostasies, each time getting worse and worse, until it was said there was no king, no absolute, no authority in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And God then performed surgery upon Israel without anesthetic. They had a civil war, and then the tribe of Benjamin was all but destroyed. But through that act, there came Samuel, and then King David. And King David had the greatest rulership, he and Solomon, that the nation of Israel ever had. So case history number 2 was worse than America, that brought great revival. Case history number 3 was whenever we find in the temple, many hundreds of years later, in shambles, and Israel is a pagan nation, having totally rejected the true God of heaven, except a remnant. And there was no Bible preaching because the Bible, the law of God, had actually been lost. Josiah, a boy of 8 years old whose father had been murdered, begins the greatest reformation the world's ever witnessed, that produced the 3 Hebrew children, Daniel, and the great influence they had worldwide. The final case history was the first apostasy in the church era. This period finds the great leader Paul in prison. He was totally rejected by all Asia, and his own words were when he was in court to determine his life and death, "No man stood with me." He was deeply depressed and had great sorrow until God comforted him and equipped him to comfort Timothy and every pastor who has ever encountered a falling away from Bible principle. Paul leaves this world in victory, having given Timothy reassurance and an antidote to overcome any period of apostasy, including ours today. This book is divided into 3 parts. The refuting of defeatism, which will create new hope and faith in believers today. Without faith, you cannot please God. The reestablishment of God's mandate and method to develop a vibrant base in training spirit-filled disciple makers. And then the clear steps in the spiritual exercise which must be followed for the spiritual awakening. These steps will lead America back and will establish her again as a healthy, God-fearing nation. Dr. Wilkins believed, and this is my firm conviction, that there'll have to be some major problem like terrorist attacks, or very likely what's happening in the Obama administration, to bring America back to where people realize that we must turn back to God, and we must stand as individuals. We must pray. We must have reformation, or it's chaos and destruction. This book would be a great gift to any pastor or Christian worker, and it's featured at $9.95. Again, the first time orders, we'll send this book and the book, the Drama at the Cross, as a bonus for anyone that orders this. It is a workbook and can be ordered in bulk for Bible studies.